Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company podcast. I'm Tim Masso here with Armand Johnston. It's 2025 and we are calling out what's new as well as naming some changes and debuts we would like to see along the way. It's great because we're in the sort of aspirational part of the watch debut season. It could be anything we want it to be, and the idea is always sweeter than the reality. But this is a interactive program, so if you have questions, comments, or show topics, send them to podcasts at the1916company.com. Armand, let's jump straight into the most interesting debut of this young year, Vacheron's 222. Tell me about it.
All right. So I was excited to see a steel 222. I like the gold 222 a lot. And you know what, Tim? We are in a really fun time of year in terms of releases. Now, striking directly on the steel, I have to be honest, I was hoping for something that was a little more monotone, similar to that of the gold piece. I was really hoping for a gray dial. Now, and I say gray dial because I was hoping it would kind of fill the gap that and correct me if I'm wrong on this reference, that the 2000V left.
Yeah, and here, that is part of my problem here. Like, I feel that the 2000V should have, I know the 222, let me just be totally clear. It's an all-time great design. I venerate the original. It was Jörg Heisig's masterpiece, and that's really saying something because he's had a long and fruitful career. By the way, Jörg Heisig's son works for us at de Bethune. So,
great guy.
Fun fact, Jörg, if you're out there, shout out. But I think that the 222 should have remained something that was more exclusive because I think there's too much overlap with the overseas here. And given the price gap of $7,000, I'm not sure what the selling point is. Because just quick note, guys. The 2000V that Armand's talking about came out with the third generation overseas in 2016. By my research, it appears that fewer than 100 were made.
And they trade for 135 to 150,000, give or take.
Which has pretty much tripled their value since the beginning of the pandemic. Those things soared when people realized how rare they were.
And truthfully, that is a perfect overseas. It's a 37 millimeter case. It is true time only, not even a seconds hand. It is a perfect ultra thin overseas.
The other thing that's really important about that watch is that it was the only time we had an overseas that could be called a jumbo, a direct equivalent to a 5711 or a 15202 AP. And it was powered by the old caliber 1120 that powered the original Vacheron 222 in 1977. So I feel like if you were going to do this and bring back a sports watch, it would have made sense to say, okay, we're going to protect the people who bought that white gold 2000V. We're bringing that back in steel now.
I could not agree more. And I don't disagree with making another 222. I understand that, Vacheron is a business, is a company, and but I almost wish it was white gold. I really, really do. I think, there's a bit to be discussed in terms of, I would say, bracelet design and finish and the $7,000 difference between this and the time date overseas. I do think there's probably a little bit of more premium finish on the bracelet. There's certainly a more premium design, in my opinion, on the bracelet. I don't know that it totally justifies. However, if you made this white gold at the same price point of the yellow gold, which I know that companies don't do very often at all, I think that would have been the talk of the town.
Yeah, now the yellow gold one that Armand's talking about came out in 2022, and I kind of hoped that Vacheron would protect the buyers of that, as well as the integrity of the 2000V as something historic and unique, by keeping the new 222 as a low-run model in precious metals. White gold, yes. Platinum, possibly. Even something a little bit different like tantalum or palladium would have been cool. If they did this in tantalum, it would be the end of the world.
Palladium would be absolutely insane.
Yeah, I would love to see a tantalum palladium subtle two-tone hybrid in the 222. That, again, would make it different from the original 222 and also different from the 2000V. I do agree with you, Armand, that the bracelet on the 222 looks and feels a lot tighter in terms of fit and finish than the bracelet on the overseas. That's a fact.
It's extremely svelte. It's extremely comfortable. And, there's a little bit more going on in the case, I believe, too, despite the fact that it's a very squarish to no shape. The Maltese cross at the 4:30, 5 o'clock marker is a really nice signature. I really like that a lot. And they're is more design that went into this, but I would make that argument if it were a brand new design. This has been done, and the design's right there.
Yeah, I think they're true to the original, which is good. The problem is
Agreed.
there's also not a whole lot new that's being said. And in a collection that already has the overseas, it'd be one thing if they came out with a historique of the 222 back in 1995. The problem is, if you really want this smaller, automatic, thin profile, full bracelet Vacheron sports watch, in 1996, we got the reference 42040, which was the original overseas. And between this new 222 and the original overseas, which was 37 millimeters, under 8 millimeters thick, automatic, and chronometer certified, I'd actually go back to the 90s and get that first generation overseas over this. Not only is the price a lot more attractive, but you get things that you can't get on a modern Vacheron. Salmon dial, Sigma dials, also tritium dials on that original overseas with a GP regulated in 5 positions, a GP 3300 that has been chronometer certified. It's the only chronometer certified Vacheron sports watch.
Ever since you taught me that the interior of the bracelet was poly noir on the first gen overseas, I've been drooling over these watches. And that's not even something that you see. It's something that you feel, and that's something that's so important. And that's, we're going to talk about some new releases and what we want to see as time goes on. But I think we can kind of put a pin in that for later, because that is something that I want to see released as time goes on. Thought for the wearer of the watch. And, something like that hasn't been done in scale for a very long time.
And if you're talking about the bracelet on the new 222, if you want the ultimate Vacheron sports watch bracelet, go back to that original overseas.
Totally agree. It's like liquid on the wrist. It's absolutely outrageous.
I would even go so far as to say this: if you wanted an historique model that no one saw coming, bring back the first generation overseas on a limited basis and sell it as part of the historic collection.
That, by the way, that would be insanely cool.
How neat would that be?
And this would fit in very well with the 222 release. Like, this is a perfect juxtaposition to the 222. That's a good call.
And I think as Vacheron, the overseas is now successful enough that you need to celebrate it instead of, creating almost like countercurrent
derivatives.
With the 222. Yeah, like I feel like the overseas self-winding, although admittedly a much larger watch, is a better all-around buy. $25,000. Look at all that you get with an overseas self-winding in steel. You get a bracelet that may not be quite as fine in detail as the 222, but every link is removable. It has a quick release system. It has 2 micro adjustments built in. With that overseas, you get a rubber strap, you get a leather strap, you get a second deploying clasp, a display case back. You get a manufacturer movement with 60 hours of power reserve, not 40 like the new 222. It's hugely anti-magnetic, and while the new 222 is 50 meters water resistant, the overseas is 150. So unless you've just got a really small wrist and an overseas is not going to happen for you, I really feel like for $25,000 you get more on an automatic overseas.
I completely agree, and especially if you go with the blue dial. The dial manufacturing process on the blue overseas is remarkable. It's a few steps short of a chronometric blue dial, which is an industry favorite for a lot of people. And when I mentioned the bracelet kind of making up for the difference in pricing, I think the dial defects from the difference in pricing a little bit. And for that exact reason, for the reason that the overseas dial is as complicated as it is, and quite honestly, as gorgeous as it is in person.
Yeah, now if you want something between the price of a 222 and say that pretty much unobtainable reference 2000V ultra thin, then maybe consider the brown dial 3rd generation overseas automatic.
The brown dial is so cool. Tim, you've mentioned that a few times over the past, probably year and a half at this point, just kind of discussing that watch. We don't know exactly how many of those were made, but it was very short run and not kind of a perfect storm. Very short run and not often purchased at the retail level. And that was one that was collector bought. That was one that was bought by somebody who's going to wear it and enjoy it rather than trade in and out of, because brown dials are so specific in that way. You can get great brown dials, such as the overseas with the brown dial, or something like a Journe Havana, which I think is a beautiful brown dial. And I won't mention the brown dials that I don't like, but it's hard to do right.
It is. And it's also a little bit polarizing. I'm not going to lie. It's a little bit like a gold-colored car. Some people love it. Some people hate it. No one's neutral.
I have a gold truck and I am not neutral. I absolutely love it.
I like it too. I think it's really cool. But then again, I remember years ago, I saw a Jeep Cherokee in XJ. It was like a 1999 at a dealer. And the dealer told me back in like 2001, it was coming off lease. He's like, I can't get rid of this. The people who love it, but they're few and far between. Another thing I would throw out there is I wish this new 222 had used the caliber 1120 of the original 222. If you're going to do a true revival and you still got the 1120 in the catalog, why is it not here?
I could not agree more. That was such one of those like low-hanging misses that I'm sure there was a reason for it, but you would think that it would be more economically sound to do it that way.
Yeah, I mean,
cheaper for the brand is the subtext there.
Yeah, I think using a 2455, that's sufficient. You know, it's Geneva Seal, it's Vacheron's own movement, but there's nothing remarkable about its decoration or its architecture. 40 hours of power reserve doesn't really stand out. There's no supplemental certification like a chronometer card. I really wish they'd just taken a little bit more time and thought about this and decided that the 1120 belonged here. Because, I mean, if you want to tie it to the original 222 and you're going for a line-for-line remake, why not bring back the movement that made it so special? The Jumbo doesn't have that at AP anymore. It's not in the 5811. Do something that would set Vacheron apart and also tie this mechanically to the original watch in a way that's directly relevant. And I think that's just a miss. I still am holding out hope that they might do it on a future Platinum model, but I think the die is pretty much cast. Every 222 is going to be the same size, same spec, just a different dial, different metal.
Truth be told, I hope that they do not release another 222. I would go to bed happy knowing that these were the only ones to be created.
Yeah, and I would like to see production constrained. Like,
oh my gosh, yes.
Call time at the end of the year on this. Okay, so that's where we are on the 222. There's a lot good. There's some things we would like to see. If you've got limitless money, buy the 2000V, or frankly, go out and buy an original 70s or 77 to 84 222, and then also consider an overseas self-winding, because for $7,000 less, you get everything and then some in terms of features. So 2025, for the most part, watches are now released all year, but Watches and Wonders is always the main event. In advance of Watches and Wonders, we're starting to see a drip of new models, of which possibly the most prominent since the 222, it's only been a few days, guys. It's the Omega Speedmaster Moonphase Meteorite. How do we feel about this? Let's talk about the watch just by itself in isolation, and then consider the price separately, because I do want to consider them separately.
Agreed. You know, I'm happy to see this release. I'm happy about a couple of things, right? I think shaving the case down by 1 millimeter was a necessary update, definitely. It is now 43 millimeter rather than 44 1/4, which I think is great. They changed the lug profile slightly as well. It's about 48.3 across the wrist from lug end to lug end. I like the Meteorite. I think it's nice. I like the black Meteorite the best. I think that's the most visually striking and just kind of represents a Speedmaster a little bit more than the silvery nickel Meteorite with the blue subs. But I think the release is great. The biggest thing that I am happy about on it is the almost full millimeter. I think it is a full millimeter difference in thickness. This is now 13.6 millimeters thick, crystal included.
And that is because
manual wind and new caliber.
Exactly. So we've been talking about the thickness of Omega watches for a while, and this is not a new story to watch collectors. Coaxials by their nature are a little bit thicker, but the fact that almost all of Omega's premium calibers are built modular on top of an 8900 base means that not only do we have the tri-level coaxial, which is the latest iteration of the escapement, but we now have modular movements on top of an already fairly thick base. So a standard 8900, I want to say it's about 5.5 millimeters, which is not crazy, but you get almost up to 7750 territory once you add a simple chronograph. Now you're up to 7.6 millimeters. You add a pointer calendar, you add a moon, you're starting to talk watches that are almost dive watch thick, even when they're not. Well, what we started seeing, I want to say back in 2022 with the Speedmaster 57, was Omega was beginning to convert its automatics into manuals simply by decapitating them, taking off the winding bridge and the rotor. And that does help with the thickness. And I'm happy to see that. That's probably the quickest way to respond to calls for thinner watches. There are some limitations, however, since the complication's still modular and the architecture is still pretty thick. So I think this is the first step towards like a new base caliber.
You know, what I will say about this caliber in general, though, is, and this isn't a dig necessarily, but it'll sound like one, it really looks like you just took the rotor off.
That's often the case with a decapitated, and that's what I call them, even though I guess it's really like cutting off the bottom, not the head.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the kind of thing where...
Kneecapped.
Yeah, I guess we'll call it a kneecap. That's right. I was trying to figure out the term for cutting off someone's butt, but I don't know if there's a phrase for that. Folks out there in cyberspace, podcasts at the1916company.com, let us know what that phrase would be in publishable terms.
Derumpetated.
Yeah. Discommoded? No, that's being taken off the throne. so yeah, it does. I've seen El Primeros that have been, I think it's the El Primero 420 caliber, I want to say, which is an El Primero that's been converted to a manual, which almost defeats the whole point of an El Primero.
Yeah.
But, you know, also when you take something like a Breguet that has originally been based on an 1150 Frederic Piguet or an 1185 Frederic Piguet chronograph, you take that off, you're left with a bare base plate or a bridge structure on which the winding system would have been mounted. So unless you're going to apply some sort of decoration like engraving or a number plate, it's going to look a little bit broad and spare. It's almost like you've cleared out a lot and the house is gone and the building is gone, but now you've got this big open space and you're ready to build whatever comes next. But I will say the two things they did right here: thinner, I love it. I don't care how you do it, Omega. I'm perfectly comfortable winding my watch every day. I've heard some people say that a fun way for Omega to move forward would be a micro rotor. How do you feel about that?
I would counter that with saying a fun way for Omega to move forward would be a bumper automatic.
Ooh. I like that. Bring
I
back...
don't like the micro rotor with Omega. Love a bumper automatic.
Yeah, because they have a catalog of bumper automatics prolifically from the 1940s and 50s. I'm all on board with that. The other thing, this is not just a thinner Speedmaster, but it's also a smaller one. The nominal size of this is 43 millimeters, whereas in the past, this type of watch in the Speedmaster collection has been 44 1/4.
And now, due to the asymmetric case of these, they all have a slight asymmetry to kind of incorporate the slight crown guards. And as the Speedmaster line evolves, it is getting slightly more symmetric, strangely enough. But this is really going to wear like a 41, I think, due to the short lugs, due to the smaller size. You know, the 44 1/4, I think wears close to a 42, 42 and a half, and I really think this is going to wear a little bit smaller than that. You know, I'm really happy to see the manual wine engagement happen with this, because it's historic with Omega. You know, it's part of the reason why the Moonwatch was chosen in general as the Moonwatch, and I really like to see manual wine coaxial coming out. I remember when we carried Omega, when I started at retail, a good friend of mine who now works with Tudor and I would wax poetic often about what we want to see in the future. And I thought it would be so cool to get just an ultra-modern Moonwatch. And ultra-modern meaning coaxial, new movement finishing, new style, silicone parts, the whole nine. And they're giving us that as time goes on. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I am super happy to see this. I really do think that Omega is building up towards a real rethink of its basic calibers. And I don't want to dwell on this too much because I talk about it on my show, but I do think you're going to see something along those lines in the future. This movement family, remember, dates back to 2007, back when 60 hours of power reserve was really ahead of the curve. Now 70 is the standard, bare minimum. And I feel like Omega, with its resources, is going to be looking at Cartier, now occupying the second spot in sales behind Rolex, and thinking like that should be us.
Now, what do we think about the pricing, Tim?
Very high. I will say this.
Agree.
At $17,000, you have to decide what your priorities are. But this also has a date. It's got a Moonphase. It's got a Meteorite dial, a ceramic bezel insert. You could argue that there's a lot of content here.
Lunar cabochon Moonphase.
Precisely. A micro adjust in the clasp. There's a lot. You get a lot for your money here. And you've got a choice of a black dial or a silver dial. Really cool. I think 17 grand, it sort of takes me back to, I want to say it was 2010 maybe, when the Speedmaster Vacheron came out, and they just priced themselves out of the market with that. it's still an exquisite watch, and when you come upon one, it's an event. But they hit the market with a body blow when they priced it, and I think the challenge is just that when a niche watch costs this much, it's difficult to expand your market share.
This watch looks great at 14.4. This watch looks absolutely fantastic at 14.4 retail. It's not outrageously mispriced, just slightly, and I think sub 15 is the answer.
Yeah.
Pricing is in a lot of different brands is currently only going one direction, though.
Yeah, I would say here's the thing. It's described as MSRP, manufacturer's suggested retail price. So if you're out there and you like this, maybe a little bit of negotiation. You know what I'm saying? It never hurts to ask. It's a great watch. It's going to be well made. And it features a lot of white gold dial hardware, which I love because that's super upscale. That's what you want to see from an Omega. And it's going to wear nice. It is smaller lug to lug. It's, I believe, 48.6. It's going to be under 14 millimeters thick. And it's got a pivoted end link bracelet, which means it's only going to wear whatever the lug to lug is. There's no end link projecting beyond the case. So in the real world, this might only wind up being about as large across the wrist as a Daytona. It's going to be thicker, but it might not be broader, which means a lot of wrists that had given up on these complicated Speedmasters suddenly have an option. I would have liked to see 100 meters, though. It's 50.
Fair point.
Okay, so what else do we have, Armin? I'm interested in hearing your suggestions because I talk too much.
Not at all. Listen, everybody wants to hear you talk, Tim. That's the difference between you and I. I really want to call out MB&F actually. With the marking the 20 years of Legacy Machine with the quote unquote Longhorn. I love Legacy Machine. I love MB&F. I think this is a really, really interesting move for them. Now, I certainly have feelings on it. For one thing, the new measurement from lug end to lug end is 53.5 millimeters across, and that's a lot. That's a big measurement.
Let's just be clear what we're talking about. We're not talking about some sort of Texas State Fair edition, or I guess if you're up in Oklahoma, worth mentioning. This is a watch with a longer, thinner, more sculpted lug profile. So if you can think of those big, chunky Legacy Machine lugs, this is very different from that. This is one step removed from something like a Patek Philippe flame lug. This is very elegant, traditional.
It's even, it's even almost like Voutilanen adjacent in terms of the shape of the
almost
lugs.
A teardrop, yeah. Like an elongated teardrop, not quite as concentrated as his.
Now, I'm curious your thought on this, but personally, I think the chunky lugs fit the case better. I feel like they match a little bit more. I feel like the measurement is much more wearable to a wide range of people, and I feel like it's just a little bit more evocative of Legacy Machine.
Yeah, I think the Legacy Machine as a concept was perfect out of the gate back in 2011. Other than changing the size and differing, complication from model to model, I don't think this revision was necessary unless they were going to just overhaul the whole thing. I don't know how I feel about just redesigning a lug to make it harder to wear.
Couldn't agree more, and this is going to appeal to less wearers than the Legacy Machine already does. Now, Legacy Machine, I would argue, is the most, not even an argument, is the most popular MB&F model that exists currently. I think it's kind of a major cornerstone of their manufacture. And, while there are a lot of large-wristed people kind of moving into this space, I would say, most people are going to have a sub 7.5-inch wrist. And most people are simply not going to be able to wear this Longhorn. Myself, with a roughly 7-inch wrist, I did the measurement with a micrometer the other day. It does not fit.
Well, I have to applaud your incompressible wrist that you can measure to the micrometer. Mine is a little bit soft and chewy. Okay. Well, I'll also say this. The move would have been no lugs. If you wanted to do something different, do what HYT did with the H0.
That would be cool.
Now you can wear a 44 on any wrist. Instead of making it harder to wear, why not just eliminate the lugs altogether?
Maybe they've opened the door for that with this. I would really hate to see them lean hard on Legacy Machine because, again, I believe it's an important part of their production that they shouldn't necessarily lean hard on. But maybe that's opening the door. Maybe this redesign is opening the door for something like that. It would be, Icopod adjacent.
Yeah, and I think, you could call it the Hellboy, because as we're all familiar, he shaves down his horns so he looks less demon-like. And there you go, the Hellboy.
Now we're talking. Now we're designing.
Can you imagine a Max Busser, Kari Voutilainen, Mike Mignola Hellboy collaboration? Oh my God, that would break
be
the internet.
Amazing. Some things I like about it. I like that they're releasing the Evo Perpetual and the Chronograph. I like that they're doing the. Gosh, I guess this is the LM2 that they're releasing as well.
Yes.
I'm not sure how I feel about the colors necessarily, but I'm not the biggest blue guy. I think in execution, the Evo is kind of hard to argue with. The movement construction, the movement design is beautiful. It's fantastic. It's very cool. But yeah, those lugs, and I even like the shape of them. It's just too big.
Yeah. So we're neutral on this. Unless you felt that the Legacy machine just specifically needed that type of lug, and that's exactly what you had in mind, this is just a lateral move for me. That's the way I'm going to describe it. So, in the out of left field category, you may be familiar with the brand Cyrus. And if you're not familiar with Cyrus, you're probably familiar with the man behind it. Jean-Francois Moujon. He was originally the complication specialist at IWC before he founded Chronode, which has built everything from modules for MB&F to entire Harry Winston Opus series watches. It's the place you go if you want to buy something really complicated and have someone else build it for you. But here's the thing. The Cyrus brand is effectively his version of what Arnold & Son is to La Joux-Perret. So La Joux-Perret makes movements for whoever writes the check, but Arnold & Son is the brand under which it can sell its own movements in a finished watch. And so Cyrus is that for Chronode and Moujon. So the Cyrus Klepcys vertical skeleton tourbillon Malachite. I don't know if it's just the fact that someone sent me a Malachite watch as a gift recently, but I'm almost feeling like it's going to be a thing this year.
Did you get one of the jump hours?
I did,
oh,
yes.
Amazing. Amazing.
The Zentier, and yes, Zentier, not Zontier, as much as I want to call it that, but the Zentier Z6 for Watch Ho & Co., a watch collector group founded by Jackie Ho out of Hong Kong. They sent me one of the 88s, the Z6, the Sauté, which is the jump hour with a malachite dial and a John Schaefer case, and I will have to show you that when we're done here. But if you have much more money to spend, there is this Cyrus, which is absolutely loaded with stuff. So we have an 18-karat rose gold case with retrograde scales for the time, an open dial, a 100-hour power reserve. It's all 44 millimeters in diameter, and it's a little bit quirky because it's got two different crowns, but one adjusts the time and winds the movement, and then pressure on the other pusher allows for quick time correction. So mechanically, it's a little bit distinct. The way it's built is beautiful because the movement is designed to be seen and seen from the dial side. So without being too overtly open dial, it allows you to see a lot of that underlying mechanism without feeling like, for example, an Hublot Aero Fusion. And it's a really good-looking application of rose gold, which I don't universally love on a watch, but this seems really cool alongside the green accents, and the symmetry of it is super neat.
This has to be like a 3N rose. It's very yellow adjacent.
It did feel to me almost like a yellow gold alloy of some kind, or yellow gold with some bronze mixed in. Just a really good looking watch. You will need the wrist for it. As a big, rectangular watch, expect this to wear quite large. That said, this is going to be a really striking, distinctive, and non-generic aesthetic. So if you want to watch from a rock-solid outfit that really knows its way around a movement, and you've got the budget and the wrist for something this large, I would say this is going to be a great alternative to something like an MB&F or an Urwerk, while definitely staying within the realm of things that are fully insurable. There are some brands out there that are very out there in terms of design and engineering, but you don't know where they're going to be tomorrow. This is a brand and a dude who's going to be around.
Now, I just want to call out, actually, the malachite aspect of this. I think it's misunderstood the difficulty in working with stone. Stone is very fickle, and while we while I love malachite, I think malachite is a great material. I think a nice solid malachite dial is amazing. This is remarkably impressive because it's slivers of malachite. It's shaped crescent moon retrograde scales of malachite. It's not a full circle. It is two, less than half circles that are like really, really slivered out in such a way that at first glance, you might not know that it's malachite. It's one of those details on this watch that doesn't scream, but it's there, and you appreciate that it's there.
Yeah, this is, by the way, I should mention, I think I kind of buried the lead a little bit here. This is also a tourbillon with a power reserve indicator shaped like a sphere and scrolling seconds. But the malachite, just as Armand has explained, is a very difficult thing to work with. The smaller the piece of stone you're working with, the more fragile it becomes. And there's an entire craft, and we call these people lapidaries, and their job is to cut and fashion stone and certain types of metals, such as shaped meteorite or gems that might be cut to form dial segments. But the lapidary works with milling tools to form things that are generally very fine and very delicate, and they're generally involved in dial craftsmanship. So I remember when I went to F.P. Journe's manufacturer in 2017, I asked about one of my favorite watches, which was the Jade Tourbillon, and the answer was, well, Francois Paul doesn't like to talk about that watch. He doesn't really want you to order it. I'm like, I couldn't imagine why. And then I found out why. It's just very difficult to make. It slows down the dial factory. The rejection rate is high. Things get damaged. They break. You got to start over again. The skills to do this are not generic. You can galvanize brass dials all day long in a mass production environment. But as soon as you're working with stone, everything slows down a lot.
And in this case particular, they're cutting it the hard way. They're going against the striations. They're not going with the lines, which, when working with any type of stone, if you catch a striation, an imperfection, you could just destroy whatever piece that you're working with.
Yeah, it'll fracture all the way through. It'll fracture all the way through, and then you have to start over again. And don't think that you can just start over with any piece you want. There has to be at least some symmetry in the shading and the texture and the color, because this is a natural material, and if you don't use matched components from similar cuts, take a look at the veneer on the dashboard of a Bentley. All those grain lines need to line up, and you can't just take another part of another tree and fix it down the line. That's why for a lot of really high-end cars, they'll actually save a little bit of the wood that originally went into the construction in case the veneer ever needs to be reconstructed. It's the same thing with this double stone dial with the two pieces of malachite. Breaking one often means scrapping the other one too. So we really like this. I think the one thing I don't like is that it's going to be very large and difficult to wear. But from a more is more standpoint, so cool.
It really, really is. And that's something that honestly flew completely under my radar.
Okay, so let's talk about something a person can actually buy now. The Longine Ultra-Chron Carbon.
I'm so happy you brought this up.
So in the middle of the 20th century, Longine, along with a couple of others, including ETA and Zenith and Gerard Perregaux, explored the world of high beat movements. So the idea of a 5 hertz or 10 beat per second movement started to gain favor in the 60s, and it made a run into the 1970s as part of like the last bastion of utilitarian mechanical watchmaking before quartz took over. So Longines has brought back the idea of the Ultra-Chron in a dive watch that is made of carbon fiber, and for $4,900 now we're talking about a watch that a person can buy. It's got a titanium bezel with an aluminum insert. It's got a carbon fiber case that looks really neat. All the hardware is titanium, and then you've got a 300-meter water resistance rating, a lovely bubble-style sapphire that's very evocative of a vintage plexiglass. And now, I don't know if, strictly speaking, this would actually qualify as a dive watch, but it's a very, very cool utilitarian sports watch across the board.
I would agree with you. I don't think it would be considered a dive watch simply because there is no rotating bezel. It is a bezel, and it does not rotate. Now, I think this piece is killer. I love the case shape first and foremost. It's very, very 70s, very classic. I love the meld of kind of the canvas or almost sailcloth style strap with the carbon fiber case. And I like the fact that I guess this is kind of a marbled forged carbon to a certain degree. I like the fact that it's mixing kind of an old style with a newer style material for watch production. I think coming in at 43 is big, but the case shape is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, it's somewhere between a tonneau and a cushion case. So big is the style when you're wearing an all black carbon watch. You don't look for the dress watch proportions in this type of construction, and it's going to be very light, being made entirely out of aluminum, titanium, sapphire, carbon fiber. As big as it is, it's going to be fairly light and wieldy and almost, I might say, toy-like. So if you don't like the super light watch, this is probably not for you. But if you want a bigger watch that wears less cumbersome, this could be a really good way of doing that.
I do wish we had a rotating bezel on this, and maybe something like a sawtooth rotating bezel too. It would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I would like to see that. I also think there's room to expand this line, though, so hold that thought. Another thing I like, no date dial. Now, I normally like the utility of a date, but something about this all-black aesthetic with the media-blasted sort of matte finish and the symmetry that comes without the date, this looks really sharp.
You know, the multi-step markers are really something to behold as well, and I think a date window, which in this case, you know, probably wouldn't have a surround that matches kind of the steps that the hour markers take, would really detract.
I would also say this, on a watch that costs under $5,000, a difference maker often is how well articulated, detailed, and executed the indices are. First of all, because at this price, you often just see printed features. But when you do see appliques, sometimes they're very rudimentary. They don't have a whole lot of different facets or changes of plane. What we have here are these lovely little tiered and faceted indices that look fantastic and also add an element of perceived premium to it. I'm going to coin that phrase, perceived premium, or PP. I will also say this. The watch is going to live up to the boast of Ultra-Chron because it's 36,000 vibrations per hour, but it's also got a 52-hour power reserve, which is solidly more than you'd expect, a silicon hairspring, so anti-magnetic, and it is a chronometer certified by Time Lab, so you might ask, to what end this high beat rate? Well, the better to meet the chronometer standards.
Now, what do you think of the price point? Yeah, not calling out Longines because I like the brand quite a bit, but this does seem to be, call it $1,500 higher than a standard.
I would say that, number one, negotiate a little bit. I think you can knock 10% off this easily. I think it would be worth it at that point. I would say that if it were $1,500 less, it would be a screaming bargain and maybe too cheap. I don't necessarily see this breaking down to Oris Aquis caliber 400 territory, but I will say that this offers some things the Aquis doesn't. The Aquis is maybe more sophisticated from a movement standpoint with the 5-day power reserve and the 10-year warranty, whereas this, with the hybrid case construction, is maybe a little bit more sophisticated from that standpoint. Again, I don't want to over-equate these two things because one's a dive watch and one's not. But I will say one thing that surprises me here that I do like is that it's thinner than I expected at 14 millimeters. I thought it would be chunkier.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, you know, I think I'm equating this to very closely to Doxa.
Okay, yeah, I see that. A lot of similarities aesthetically.
Yeah, and I think I'm not, well, admittedly, I'm not exactly sure what the forged carbon Doxa sells for currently, but I'd be curious. But, you know, the Doxa bread and butter, I would say, is in the sub $4,000 range for the most part.
I think that the sophistication of the movement is what's going to set this apart, because I'm looking at the Doxa sub 300 carbon now. I've called this up, and I think it's important to compare apples to apples. They're not exactly the same thing because the Doxa is a true dive watch. But if you look at something like the Doxa sub 300 carbon, now we got a carbon case, the familiar professional orange dial. It's $3,990, so let's call this $4,000. I think that given basically a 38-hour power reserve, I probably Salida SW200 certified versus a Time Lab certified high beat 52-hour power reserve movement, especially since the Longine is going to have the silicone hairspring and the sub's not. I think the Longine justifies its premium, but I would still hold out for that 10% discount, because if we're talking about a watch that costs, you know, let's say $500 less, I think it does edge out the Doxa. Keep in mind, though, the Doxa with a rotating bezel is a slightly different type of watch, so we just got to keep that in mind. And the Doxa is also probably a little bit smaller in terms of thickness.
Yeah, and how
size.
it'll wear, definitely.
So not a perfect comparison, but people compare unlike things all day long. Someone will go online and they'll compare like a Alfa Romeo Giulia to an F-150 Lightning. They'll be like, I've got this much amount of money to spend. I'm going to consider everything that costs this much. And people do watch shop that way. Okay. So now things we'd like to see this year. Let's talk about things we would like to see. I would love to see more tantalum. I don't think that there are enough tantalum watches out there. I think it's an interesting material, and technology has finally brought it back within reach of brands that are not able to throw away one set of tools for one case. Like, I think tantalum now, it's not the 80s, it's not the 90s, it's not even the 2000s. There was a time when platinum was hard to work with. There was a time when titanium was considered tough to mill and finish. I think we're now in the era when you can have a tantalum watch that does not cost $40,000.
You know, I think it can be simplified to if a brand as small as J.N. Shapiro can turn out tantalum in the capacity and at the level that they do. It's not to say that they're not a fantastic brand, but big brands should be able to do that too, and at scale.
Yeah, I do think that we're going to see more and more of that. If Josh Shapiro and Sartori Biard can do this, I'm under no illusions that they've got a little bit of help working on tantalum. But if there are resources out there to make this happen, I think we need to see more of it. First, because it's genuinely cool. Second, because it's one of the few sort of unturned stones. Everything's been done a million times in this industry, whereas I feel like tantalum is still a can that most brands haven't opened yet. It's been sitting there on the shelf. Now it's time to use it.
And, there's just something to be said about kind of standing out by not being the first, but being the first of a trend. So I do think if the trend starts, any brand jumping on early is going to do a great job, do a good job for themselves. They're going to do a good job on their open market and just kind of get there before some of the other big brands. So I would love to see some tantalum and some different type of materials in general. You mentioned Palladium earlier, and there are a few watches that I can call out that have been done in Palladium. The most notable to me was a UN. And I think you're spot on with just a material shift.
Yeah, definitely something to look into. Palladium, it's a hallmarked precious metal, but it's not going to cost anywhere as much as gold or platinum, while still giving you that cachet that comes with a weighty precious metal hallmarked watch. You're right, Ulysse Nardin did do a run of them, the Macho Palladium, which I think was there to amortize the tooling from the UN 160 watch because they were exactly the same shape. And then also, believe it or not, Arnold & Son did Palladium, including an Ultra-Thin Tourbillon.
That's right.
Also, very briefly, and this is not going to be exhaustive, but very briefly, Vacheron on the Catelille. It was an option back when you could specify case metals.
Oh, when they had the configurator on their website. That was, what, 2015?
I mean, even further back than that, like right at the beginning of the 2000s, like 2008, 9, 10, 11, that sort of thing.
That was dark times for the Catelille.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, they launched it into the teeth of a recession. It was a weird watch that was tough to understand, but it proved something that is baffling to many, but true time and again. People would rather have few iconic options than limitless choice. Because if you look at what people want, they want these highly standardized, long-term, stable designs. A Nautilus. They want a Aquanaut. They want a Royal Oak. They want a Calatrava. What they don't generally want is like the Patek Philippe sculpture or the Catelille, where you've got all these different varieties of a watch that's kind of obscure. In theory, you could make it your own. In reality, most people don't want to. So the other thing I think we're going to see is too many microbrands. Now, I'm not going to name names here because I want them all to succeed, but I also acknowledge they can't. Armand.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you took the thought out of my head. Truth be told, I don't want them all to succeed, Tim. I think the space is getting outrageously crowded. And, we talk about independence and having, orological significance to speak of. These microbrands largely do not. They have nothing to say, and a lot of times, and again, I won't name names either. I have the ones that I like, the ones that I don't like, the ones that I like that do all the things that I complain about, and the ones that I don't like that do all the things that they complain about. But, it's just more of the same.
I'm talking about stuff that's just, you called a company in Hong Kong, they made the case, they made the dial, you basically sent them some rough sketches of what you wanted, and then you put your name on the dial. That sort of thing adds nothing to the discussion. It's like years ago when there were too many hand builders of bikes at the trade shows, and you'd see 50 booths of people welding together the same Columbus or Reynolds tubes, and be like, well, this is great, but I mean, you're making the same kind of diamond frame. You're welding the tubes the same way. You're all using the same suppliers. Your dropouts, your lugs, they all come from the same place. And your paint's nice, and I love your image, and it's cool that your logo is a dog on a bike eating pizza with a skate helmet. But other than the attitude and the marketing, there's not a lot of new ideas here, and that's the way it is with a lot of these watch micro brands.
Attitude and marketing, you nailed what drives micro brands, and those two words specifically, when it should be design and, or arguably horology. Even if you're using off-the-shelf movements, it doesn't mean you can't do something interesting with it. It doesn't mean you can't do something different with it.
And let me just be clear that micro brand, before I offend who knows how many people out there that I know personally, micro brand doesn't mean a small independent watch brand. You've got people like a Josh Shapiro or Yosuke Sakaguchi who are working on the tail end of years spent building up to crafting watches that reflect their auteur visions, extraordinary investments in time and training and talent and tooling. And they're creating lasting statements of their individual visions that happen to be sold on a micro scale. That's not what I mean. I mean watches that are relatively cheap and sell on style and image and marketing, things that are very surface level.
Things that pop up and disappear with no pomp, no circumstance, and without even the owners knowing.
Yeah, and it's one thing to say, oh, well, I met the guy at Watch Time New York and he's a cool dude. That's great. But unless you're willing to just say, well, this was a fun lark and now it's done someday, because the brand will probably disappear, and unless it's got a movement or parts that are easily serviceable, a lot of these micro brands are now operating on a level that we traditionally describe as like a fashion watch, where there's really no long-term service and parts plan, nor is there any intended. You're just buying something that's sort of fast fashion in a watch form.
Very well said. I think the line of micro brand and fashion watch is getting extremely blurry as time goes on, because even fashion watches, there are automatic versions of just grasping at straws here, but I'm sure there's an automatic Michael Kors out there.
Well, I mean, hell, there's the Swatch System 51 for $150. You've got an automatic watch.
There you go. And I would even argue that that's even a more significant movement than we see in a lot of these micro brands. It has interest. It's a center screw pivot that's not hand touched by anybody.
Some sort of Chinese off the shelf caliber that was put together and will never. It's almost like IKEA. It's put together once. If you ever take it apart, it will not.
It will never
together.
go back together again, and it's not going to be pretty taking it apart.
Okay, now other things we'd like to see. Well, I think now it's time to talk about the Golden Elipse and the Calatrava again.
I have been on this soapbox for a while now, but I just want more black dial yellow gold dress watches. I think there is nothing more classic than a yellow gold black dial, and I think Patek can do it better than possibly anybody. In the Calatrava line, Golden Elipse is a personal favorite of mine, so I'm very glad you brought that up. But Calatrava line, a 6196J 001 black dial would be murderously good, and just borrow reference 96. Borrow that, increase the size a little bit, slightly change the lugs, maybe shorten them. Do what you do, Patek, but yellow gold, black dial, and take it a step further. Let's bring back some black enameling. Let's put some black enamel in a relatively affordable dress watch.
Yeah, and I think the Golden Elipse is a perfect platform for that.
Agreed.
If you can't quite swing the full enamel engraved dial, 5738, I think that's the 51P, I want to say. If you can't quite swing that, still get a Golden Elipse in white gold with a black enamel dial. That's really slick. And because Patek can do black and dark blue enamel, they're operating on a level where others really can't, because it's still very hard to do dark enamel that doesn't look like an orange peel, but Patek can. And so having cleared that bar, I'd love to see more enamel dial golden ellipses. And I would love to see what Armand just shouted out, a really high contrast yellow gold black dial Patek dress watch. Think about the old 5070J.
Yes.
The chronograph that came out in 1998. So much power to that dial with gilt style printing, a black base and a yellow gold case, and it still looks great today. Not a whole lot of late 90s watches still look that forceful today. Look like they could come out today and still cut it.
And you nailed it with the aspect of contrast, and that's what's missing. I like a silver dial as much as the next guy, but there's really something to be said when you get a nice, clean, stark black. And it's impossible. Like a black car, it's impossible to hide blemishes. You cannot have a blemish on a black dial. You will see it instantly. And quite honestly, that's why I think a lot of brands steer away from doing that deep, dark black.
Yeah, I would also say that if you're going to do Patek, if you're going to do this kind of like yellow gold black dial dress watch, take one of the best features of the 5070 and combine it with one of the best features of the 5296, which is the old sector style dial.
Oh, man.
Gilt print on black sector dial.
That would be straight out of the late 50s, and that would be absolutely incredible.
I'm all about that. I would love to see that. Please, Patek, make this happen. Otherwise, I would say that I would love to see just generally thinner watches across all brands. And I don't mean everyone has to turn into Piaget, but let's admit that, look, in the 2000s, the Flex was having tourbillon. It was having bigger watches and 1, 2, 3, even 4 tourbillon. Back in the 2010s, it was a combination of being built by a chic independent or being some sort of a sports watch, like the super luxury sports watch. That was the phenomenon of the 2010s. And I think now that we've explored every case material to exhaustion, except maybe tantalum and palladium, let's start talking about making watches thinner again and how we can do this without compromising durability, accuracy, water resistance. Let's start that discussion again, because there are a lot of brands that are seemingly right on the cusp of introducing new models or model lines like Universal Genève at Breitling, where this should be part of the brief from the beginning.
I think there's a lot of, I know that there's a lot of complacency in the watch industry, and I think thickness is really where we'll see that personified, because there aren't a lot of brands that focus on that, and I like what Piaget does, chasing the dragon that is 2 dimensions, effectively, but quite honestly, that is too thin. More watches in the call it 6 to 10 millimeter range is really the sweet spot. You don't need to go sub 6. Hell, you probably don't need to go sub 8. It really will depend heavily on the case design. And I think if you just make that push, you will challenge a lot of other brands.
That's a very good point. And I think being first is going to be important, because it's always important to be on the vanguard of a trend. Even if ultimately someone creates the best version of a style of watch, being first out of the gate. Look, I'm not saying the Royal Oak is the ultimate integrated bracelet sports watch, but it's certainly the one that is foremost in the imagination because it was first out of the gate back in 1972.
Think about an LUC Chopard with a 7.5 millimeter thickness, time, seconds, no date, just elegant, dressy, up to the standards of Chopard and kind of the LUC carve out, just that thickness.
That's a good idea. I like that a lot. Please, someone out there make that happen. And actually, along those lines, Armand, let's talk about what we're collecting in 2025. Now, Roger Dubuis from the Roger Dubuis era has been discovered, for example, and F. P. Journe has been discovered. And I think everything ever made in the early days of marquee watchmakers has pretty much been discovered. People understand that if you've got the Philippe Dufour Daniel Roth, C117 perpetual calendar from the 90s, that's now a blue chip watch. An early Daniel Roth is highly collectible. What are the discoveries that we want to get before the masses realize what they're missing?
Tim, you have said it, and you are on it with 80s and early 90s Breguet. Without a doubt, I look at a lot of watches daily. I think that is truly the answer, and I think that there's so much that it rivals, and there's so many brands that were not doing anything remarkably close at the time that we hold in such high standard now. And Breguet currently, I don't want to be hyperbolic, is a dead language.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a brand that had a lot of energy behind it when the Swatch Group bought it, and then for the first 10 years under Swatch, they just went gangbusters in product development. But ultimately, they didn't wind up with a brand that people identify with. If you want the high end, people go with the Lange or Holy Trinity. If you want an independent, you're going to go much lower volume. And if you want a brand that is identifiable with a human being, in general, you've got so many examples of legendary living human beings still working in the space that there's no need to astroturf the contribution of a guy who's been dead for over 200 years. Breguet himself has much less influence on the brand today than the very alive Daniel Roth. Like Daniel Roth, if we want to use the T in the TH sound that the French Swiss use, Daniel Roth, I just don't want to confuse him with David Lee, but he was, along with Louis Maurice Caillet and Francois Baudet, in charge of the Chaumet brothers era of Breguet from the late 70s through the 80s and into the early 90s. His influence was still felt. And those Breguet watches developed in that period are more Daniel Roth watches than the Daniel Roth brand of today. And in a lot of ways, they're even more unique because back then, the Breguet operation was incredibly small. And if you look at Fabrique du Temps today, they make great watches. The new Daniel Roth watches will be great, but that's a factory. I've been there. The small workshop that they had in Le Sentier during the 1980s turned out very few watches. So if you get their Moonphase watches, if you get their Tourbillon, if you get their calendars, those 80s Daniel Roth designed Breguets are basically what we would have if we knew which watches like F.P. Journe designed in the 90s for other clients. We don't know because of non-disclosure agreements, and we may not know until after he's dead. But right now, we know that Daniel Roth created the image of the modern Breguet in the 80s, and those watches languish at auctions for very little money. Also, out of the left field, Cédric Jonner and the original Abyss with the Chopard caliber 196 movement. He was the only one ever allowed to use the Chopard caliber externally.
I fell in love with Jonner over lockdown in 2020, and it was kind of a really fun dive because interesting watchmaker.
Yeah, interesting because he started at Chopard as a watchmaker and a jeweler, and because of that relationship, he was allowed to use the original Michel Parmigiani designed caliber 196, the one that was a chronometer, that was Geneva sealed, that was a micro rotor, that was beautiful. He was allowed to use that in his incredibly distinctive Abyss case design in the late 90s and early 2000s. But if you want something that's just as finely constructed as any Patek Philippe or Vacheron or Lange from that period, that rivals Journe for inventiveness and Parmigiani for mechanical innovation, that Abyss powered by the Parmigiani designed Chopard 196, find them now. Buy two, one for the safe and one for your wrist.
I was just seeing if I could pull up any of those actually, because it's funny, that is a very lesser known brand
and very hard to find. These are extremely handmade watches, super distinctive in the same sense that the Daniel Roth Elipse Curvex case was super distinctive. The Abyss is super distinctive. It's something you cannot miss once you see it.
This is going to be a fun rabbit hole. Oh yeah, you mentioned inventiveness. I would also argue the whimsy behind this brand is really, really something, because it's Frank Mueller adjacent, it's F.P. Journe adjacent in terms of the whimsy. It's not a watch that screams serious, and I really, really gravitate towards that.
The final thing I think we need to be aware of going into this year from a collector's standpoint is Franck Muller complicated watches made while Franck was still running the show. The brand is so out of fashion now that we completely sleep on those halcyon early years.
You know, the master of complications phrase is absolutely true. And Franck Muller, when he was at the helm, did outrageous things. And I think it's so funny to see, you know, even some more modern production Franck Muller tourbillons just looked at as worthless. It's so funny to see that because there was a time when the brand could not be broken.
And it was the first truly successful independent. There were others independent before Franck. But first of all, Franck was working independently in the 80s. He just didn't have the brand on the name of the shop, but he was building stuff for everyone back in the 80s. F.P. Journe has waxed extensive about how much talent Franck had back when they were coming up in the watchmaking industry in the 80s. And people know about Journe. I'm not sure they recognize what a watchmaker Franck Muller was, or that the stuff made in the early years truly does reflect his vision. Get into those now, because I feel like the brand has gotten so uncool with its kind of drifting direction in the modern era that people forget how electrifying and original and rare those early Franck complications were.
And you know, if you're one for a story, I'm always one for a story. There are so many insane stories about Franck Muller, about his, you know, the people in his distribution that are, you know, largely, you know, cocaine fueled and drug fueled and just hilarious.
That's a very 80s story you're telling here.
Stories that are like, it will blow your mind, some of the Franck Muller stories that you'll hear. And it's just rock star watchmaking energy at a time when it wasn't cool to be a rock star watchmaker.
Yeah, I agree. I think someday there might be a movement towards Vincent Calabrese, Sven Anderson, and Paul Gerber watches. We're not there yet, but I think Franck's time, at least the early, the special, the distinctive, the non-ETA powered stuff, that time is coming. Armand, where can people find us?
You can find me on Instagram at It's Me Armand, or via email at armand@the1916company.com.
And I am Tim _Masso on Instagram. Hit me up. Until then, time out.